Welcome to this discussion on security in the Horn of Africa with His Excellency Deputy Prime Minister of the Federal Government of Somalia, His Excellency Salah Jama. It is a pleasure to welcome His Excellency to this session, considering the importance of all the development that are taking place today in the Horn of Africa. Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister is formerly a Minister of Labor as well as a Minister of Constitutional Affairs. So he brings today a wealth of knowledge and a spectrum of ideas on what's happening in his home country, but also in the area. Your Excellency, welcome to CSIS.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mabit. It's a pleasure to be here. It's not that long ago that our president was here, about 17 months ago, and he gave your audience an overview of the developments back home. And I'm delighted to be here today to have a discussion with you on what's happening in Somalia and the larger Horn of Africa region.
What brings you to Washington?
Well, quite a number of things. Primarily, I am here to attend the World Bank's Fragility Forum, where practitioners and leaders around the world convene to deliberate about how to deal with states that are recovering from fragility. And Somalia happens to be one of those states that is making great strides in getting out of, not failure, but a long time ago, but fragility, and getting into more development and more long-term government programs and agendas. So we are here to share our experience with the rest of the world and draw on what others are doing in that front in terms of dealing with multiple threats that some of our societies face in terms of insecurity at times, but also climate change impact and other fragility issues that need a comprehensive national agenda, but also global instruments to cope with them. I also, on the side, get to meet and give our perspective to institutions like yours, maybe meet government officials.
Thank you very much. Somalia has been at the forefront of the discourse on fragility, the discourse on insecurity for a long time. You yourself, Your Excellency, are an expert, a student of reconstruction and post-conflict situations. Where does Somalia stand today? Well, last time we hosted the President Mahmoud was here, and he laid out his vision. He said he will go after Al-Shabab, cut off its head, these are his words, and then restore the rule of law and security and peace into the region. Where does your country stand today?
I think that is a very good question to begin with. I think Somalia has come a long way from the days where it used to be depicted as a failed state in the media some 30 years ago, 20 years ago. But I would say in the last 12 years or so, ever since we got out of the transition, Somali government in partnership with its citizens has really come a long way in terms of laying the foundations for the institutions of the Somali state, building viable public financial management, security apparatus, inclusive politics institutions. The foundations have been laid in the form of a constitution that is about to be finalized and getting out of a draft to a more completed one. In terms of deciding on the type of electoral systems and processes that we are going to utilize to participate in politics and also get represented. But more so, in just the last year itself, Somalia has completed the HIPC initiative, which is the debt relief program, and it was only in December last year. We also were able to successfully meet the requirements so that the UN could lift a long-standing arms embargo on Somalia, well over 30 years. And Somalia has in the meanwhile been able to join the East African Economic Community, part of the Horn of Africa Initiative for Integration So both regionally and domestically, and more importantly, the president's vision when he went into elections and the program that we as a government have taken to the parliament is premised on a set of key policy choices. One of them is creating a Somalia that's at peace with itself and with its neighbors and the rest of the world. And in that front, we have waged a very successful war against al-Shabab. That is, I think, highly documented now and known to our partners. And defeating al-Shabab and recovering hundreds and of kilometers of land districts and regions, liberating tens of thousands of Somalis that lived under al-Shabab for a long time. And in the first phase of our operations, I think a great success has been registered, despite challenges in terms of drought sometimes and floods and some environmental factors that might create hindrance here and there. The mission has been very successful and it continues on. So I think these are good times for Somalia and for the Somali people to be proud of what they are achieving. For us as a government, it would not have been possible to defeat al-Shabab in these operations primarily without the partnership of the communities, local communities that played a fundamental role, and also our partners who provide us strategic and expertise support in some of the areas.
It's a long list of achievements or initiatives that the federal government of Somalia has undertaken. Let's just dissect some of them. We'll just go to the list that you mentioned. There's the Constitution, the Electoral System, HIPEC initiative. You have the embargo that has been lifted. You've joined the EAC. Let's go piece by piece. The Constitution, where are we today? I mean, Somalia, of course, has had elections. The president came through election. It's his second time at the helms of the country. You are an expert, having worked in that space. So just briefly, where are we with the elections? And then we can go through the list.
Well, I think as the former Minister of Constitutional Affairs, I can attest to the fact that previously the constitutional debate as such was kept as a backburner issue. It did not get the necessary political will across the leadership in the country or the actors in terms of prioritizing it as a top national issue. You could know that by just looking at the history of the constitutional making process. It was in 2012 that the draft constitution that we have was adopted or finalized in its draft format for the parliament and other national leaders to complete by agreeing on a set of remaining less than 10 items of top priority. But prior to that, it was in 2000 and 2004 that the charter laid the initial foundations of the Somali constitution by pronouncing Somalia as a constitutional democracy and a federal state. Well, those were in principle agreed upon. But the dissecting and deliberation of the tenets and agreeing on the modalities and the principles of those ideals were left for a later day. So, I mean, a lot have been achieved prior to now, which is like the formation of the federal member states, putting in place a public financial management system, basic institutional development. But all those gains would be in vain without having the rules of the game being agreed upon. So that is why for this president and our prime minister and the current cabinet, in collaboration with the federal member states, pushing the agenda of completing the constitutional review process, or at least initiating a national debate so that the citizens get to present their perspectives and hear what are the different choices. I could just name a few items that remain to be contentious. One of the how are we going to delineate power between the different spheres of government, the federal government, the federal member states, municipalities, and over 30% of the world's population, if not 40, live under federations. So it's not a rocket science per se, but it's highly contentious political environment. In America, when federalism was being adopted, it had to come from bottom up, where big leaders from different regions joined and decided on what kind of federation they're going to have. Maybe in Russia and other African countries, it was top down, where a very centralized, huge state went through crisis and federalism was prescribed as a means of holding the nation together. So for us, we have few powers that are now assigned for the federal government, but the rest have to be debated. And there are options that the parliament now has the leadership. There's something called the National Consultative Forum that deliberates about big political issues. They develop options, and now it's presented to the parliament for discussion. And eventually it will lead to a referendum and then a total ratification of the constitution.
What is the timeline for the referendum?
Well, I think the first 4 chapters are currently being deliberated, and within a matter of days it should be finalized, the first 4 chapters. So it's going to be chapter after chapter. So within a matter of months, perhaps they should be able to cover some of the key issues.
And then the referendum will cover the entire process?
Yes, the referendum would be the final stage. After it goes through the parliamentary process, different ideas are, incorporated, more public consultation, and eventually it will culminate into a referendum.
And that may be a year from now? Do you have a better sense of
around that range?
Okay. Then you also talk about the electoral system. What kind of consolidation have you undertaken in that space?
Well, Somalia's experimentation with democracy has not begun today. I mean, in 1960, when we became an independent state, we opted for a multi-party system, and we experimented with that from 1960 to 69. But we had a history where about 80 to 120 political parties were formed, and much of them were not based on ideals, but rather office-seeking mentality, where the rest of them would join the main party, and that collapsed and led to the emergence of a military dictatorship. So now the people are very curious about what is it we're going to opt for this time. I think the general consensus is that Somalia should have a proportional electoral model based on a national constituency. That is the advice we're getting from experts around the world, and that is the emerging consensus among the Somali political leadership, that perhaps this is the model that would allow for the representation of diverse groups, particularly the minorities and some of these geographic parts of Somalia that are going through political reintegration into the unity, like Somaliland.
And does this mean that you are keen on making this a one person, one vote? Or do we still have this target system that had been contentious in the past?
Well, I think from 2012, when a clan elder had the authority to sign off who gets to be an MP, to 2016, when a delegation of 50 members was designed to elect an MP, to 2022, where about 100 delegates elected an MP, and we have 275 MPs in the House of the People, and then the Senate has 54. I think it's about time that we increase the base and the legitimacy of our democracy, and the aim is to have a universal franchise, despite being knowledgeable of the challenges in some of the areas. And that's why we have identified the defeat of al-Shabab as a necessary prerequisite for democratization, for good governance, and for public service delivery at large.
One element that has always been challenging, not just in Somalia, across the world, you alluded to it, which is representation. And in structured society like Somalia, representation of women and youth can be a challenge. And you mentioned the clan elders, which when you say clan elders, it brings up images of youth, the friction with youth, and the place of women in that society. And we know, of course, women remain a very important part of our societies.
Well, gentlemen, you will be very surprised to know that Somalia actually outperforms many other African countries in terms of women's representation, at least in the federal parliament. Maybe the results are not as great when it comes to the subnational entities, but in the federal parliament for the last 2 elections, our target was to meet a 30% women quota. Of course, we had to use a lot of political pressure to compel, subnational entities and others who are in charge of elections to ensure that women's representation is maintained at least at that certain percentage. But increasingly, the Somali women have access to education. They are able to voice their preference in the public domain. And the Somali society per se is one that, despite the interpretation some may have from faraway distance, in which women are given leadership roles and they can exercise their political will. But there are challenges, as is the case in some areas. And as a government, we are very aware of that, and there is a lot of public awareness and outreach happening in those areas too.
You said 30% was the quota or that you had assigned as a government. Where are we in relation to that? Have you reached that quota, or
about 20 over 24?
About 20 to 24. It's a long way to go still. HIPC, you mentioned HIPC. This has been an instrument that a lot of countries have taken advantage of to transition to economic progress. How did that come about for Somalia, which is still grappling with a lot of security issues, which affect trade, which affect the economy and everything else? But yet, congratulations for achieving that. Can you talk to us about how you went about it and what do you foresee projecting, given, notwithstanding the challenges you just described with Al-Shabab?
Well, the journey was not an easy one. It was a very excruciating national agenda for all of us to develop the budgetary and fiscal discipline and put a lot of measures, policies, regulatory frameworks in place, despite the limited fiscal space. We had to put in place a functioning and central bank, and Auditor General's office, Ministry of Finance, and a whole host of laws, regulations, and policies that go along with it, and the systems where the payment for the civil servants and the security personnel is done in an electronic and automated manner, and rather than handing out cash that used to be the norm in the past. A lot of people contributed to that. We had to increase our revenue base. We had to control our expenditure. We had to develop all kind of other sectoral policies and align those with our national development plan, at the center of which was the poverty reduction or poverty eradication agenda. So if I could give you a bit of context, we're doing all that despite fighting of Al-Shabab, despite Al-Shabab occupying some of the most fertile parts of Somalia that would have enhanced our trading capabilities and basic economic growth. We're doing that despite Somalia and the Horn of Africa being at the forefront of the impact of climate change, where you go without rains for about 4 seasons in a row, something that is unprecedented in our history. We are caught between the threat of famine and floods. In the last 1 year, I had to work on both extreme ends of this vicious cycle that affects us. But the Somali people are by nature a very resilient people who are, over the years, developed the capabilities to deal with this. So as we were working on economic growth and fiscal policies, we also had to put in place things like national social safety nets, this time designed by the government in collaboration with institutions like the World Bank. Maybe they're implemented by different partners, but it is a national agenda now. We realize the idea of taking stock of the vulnerabilities of your community and society is very important in order to come up with the most viable policy solutions. We're also focusing on human capital development, where we recently recruited about 6,000 teachers. Prior to that point, there were no teachers in public schools. Much of our education was run by NGOs from East and West, being thankful to all of them. But I think for a government to bring about transformation in society, it needs to work on its own, and that needs to be the role of ownership and local solutions to our problems. So from social safety nets to human capital development, to coping and adapting to climate change, and the pursuit of development policy. So in a nutshell, we're moving away from a humanitarian crisis that is reoccurring all the time to stabilization and perhaps more resilience and durable solutions to a development agenda. It's a long-term trajectory expressed by the President's Vision 2060. And that would be reached by working on a sequenced set of 5-year national development plans that now we are calling more transformational plans that should bring about a transformational change in the livelihoods of our people. We're also vulnerable to global volatility in global markets. Remittance plays an important role in our delivery of service to some of the people. Food supply lines, wars. So for the first time, the Somali state, despite some capacity challenges, is willing to and forced to grapple with these questions so that we can find solutions on our own.
You described some of this friction. You didn't call them that, but that's really what it is. If you have limited resources, you're facing a major challenge on the security front. The issues of social development, the issues of economic development. You mentioned the President's agenda. You have climate change. But yet you also have to respond to the demands, if you will, of the international community. Your partners will grant you HIPC at IMF and other Bretton Woods institutions. How do you struggle with, what do you do where you're still working to unify your country? And you say you just recruited 6,000 teachers. Are those teachers distributed equitably across the country, or some regions get more access to education than others? So how do you juggle all these very pressing matters while meeting the demands of your partners?
Well, as you have rightfully observed, it's a very contradictory and competing policy choices, and one has to face what we call policy trade-offs. An investment in teachers or in health, or an investment because to fight off al-Shabab and ensure that Somalia meets the deadline of 2024, the end of 2024, the Somali security forces are scheduled to take over all the responsibilities from ATMIS, which formerly used to be called AMISOM, which means right now we have drawn down 2,000 and 3,000, total of 5,000 ATMIS security personnel from African countries. We have replaced them with Somali trained and equipped Somali security forces. And that means we had to train tens of thousands of new military personnel. That comes with a lot of fiscal and budgetary constraints. So sometimes you have to trade off between investing in security or investing in social service. And on top of that, an unexpected wave of climate shocks or floods renders millions of people that were able to look after their cattle, rare animals, or do subsistence farming, renders them IDPs on the outskirts of big cities. So that's why the notion of understanding the different dimensions of fragility is very important. And realizing that this needs a very integrated and comprehensive approach. So our partners do work in environments similar to Somalia, across Africa and elsewhere, where conflict and fragility aspects are all interacting and making people. When I said sometime back, when a drought hits California, you don't see the loss of life. But in places like the Horn of Africa, people are more vulnerable than they could be. So we have learned to cope with and develop the mechanisms to prioritize our policies and make sure that we don't lose sight of the importance of each and every one. Maybe we will not reach our goals tomorrow, but for sure we will reach them somewhere down the line in the near future.
On the distribution of the teachers, how do you make that trade-off?
The distribution is done in equal terms. All the regions have, I mean, the federal government of Somalia is expected to serve all the regions of Somalia, and we strive to ensure that accessibility to education and health is available across the country. And in some areas, the NGOs play an important role in that.
Obviously, there are communities, I suspect, we feel a greater need for physical security now and less while they appreciate education. Mm-hmm. They may ask you as the federal government, is like, why are you doing all these stricting measures, right? Because you have to tighten the belt to meet those requirements, mm-hmm. which means something gives. That can also drive public discontent.
Well, the priorities and the desires of people shifts from one level to the other. There are some communities that are under Al-Shabab, and for them, I guess the first priority is, when is the government going to liberate us from Al-Shabab? After we do the liberation, and we have seen that in the last year and a half, we have developed programs called stabilization programs that right away deal with humanitarian assistance being available too, because when there is a conflict, there is always displacement of people and disturbance in their livelihoods. So we have a series of steps that we follow. We provide humanitarian assistance after liberation. Then we provide basic services in districts. Like there is this district called Haradere that was recently liberated from Al-Shabab. We ensure that things like basic schooling and health are available, and water, which is very important. And this becomes a source of legitimacy for the Somali state. But we have to do all this across different regions.
And responding to different needs.
Different needs. So it's a very complex environment, and a demanding one at that.
The other element that you mentioned was, vulnerable communities. Waging war, prosecuting war is very costly. It costs resources, financial, blood, sweat, costs lives. But waging peace is even more challenging, and in a situation like what your country is facing, can even more. How do you ensure that specifically the herdsmen community that have been vulnerable to Al-Shabab, who've been fighting alongside the government, fighting Al-Shabab, how do you protect those? How do you ensure that not only these vulnerable communities get the support they need, the protection, but also that you address all the fault lines that you have across the country, including the fact that Al-Shabab is very entrenched in a lot of communities. Experts like yourself or other analysts have come to agree that it's very difficult to vanquish an insurgency, be it Al-Shabab or any other insurgency, just through military operations.
Well, I think this question of how to deal with insurgencies of Al-Shabaab's nature is something that occupies the minds of many analysts, practitioners, governments, from all the way in Western Africa to Central Africa, East Africa, and many other parts of the world. But for us as a Somali, our president had the luxury of being a president before. And he has seen, as he told you last time when he was here, what were the gaps in our security policy. I must admit, when I first came back to Somalia, I worked with the Somali police force. And my observation then was that the security agenda was a byproduct of the war on terror. Much of it was externally driven, at least in terms of setting the agenda. Much of it was externally influenced, at least in terms of prioritizing. And the agenda back then was to contain Al-Shabab, as the president has articulated in various forums, within the confines of the Somali state. So not to have the spillover effect of Al-Shabab in the Red Sea area, which is a very significant trading route, or maybe in the other parts of Africa. And that policy has not come to fruition. Al-Shabab has shown to be a very potent enemy in Somalia, killing hundreds and thousands of Somalis on a regular basis, and also creating havoc in East Africa. So the policy that we have adopted now, and I think with a great deal of appreciation from our partners and the Somali people, is that the fight against Al-Shabab is not going to be purely on mechanical terms, military terms, with military hardware, boots on the ground. That's not enough. Al-Shabab is a very mobile, very agile, less accountable entity that can go underground for weeks and research. So we have come up with a three-pronged approach of trying to, first of all, attack the ideological foundations of Al-Shabab as the authority that claims to fight on behalf of Islam and appeal to the noble principles of our religion. We call upon a gathering of all the Somali religious scholars, the ulama in Mogadishu, from within Somalia and all the way from America, Australia, other parts of the Arabian Gulf. And they came to Somalia, sat for almost a week, and issued a fatwa, where they, despite their differences, different schools of thought among the scholars, where they collectively, unanimously, and categorically rejected and nullified Al-Shabaab's claim to Islamic ideals as part of their war. That's one. And we also develop other set of instruments and public engagement mechanisms where outreach is done to various communities. That's the ideological basis of our war. The other one is the financial. Al-Shabaab does not resemble a religious entity. At best, it resembles a mafia group. Their ability to generate revenue by creating havoc in communities, threatening people, their life, developing sophisticated mechanisms. So we have come up with a series of measures to attack their financial sources and checkpoints that they use across the country, but also the financial systems, private sector, banking institutions, the EVC, which is an electronic money transfer system. And a lot of actions have been taken, and we believe we have really diminished their capacity to generate finances so that they can harm the Somali people. And finally, it's the military one. And in that one, we are increasingly coming to realize that more than fighting off Al-Shabaab, the prospect of retaining that location, holding capabilities is more important. So we have learned that through the hard way, and now we know what does it take to hold a place. Fighting an enemy that is very agile and drawing on experience from elsewhere, using very destructive and devastating means of causing harm. So we lost the lives of many young men and women who fought bravely against Al-Shabaab, and we are trying to build on those gains and ensure that Al-Shabaab is eradicated. The reason is we cannot serve our public, we cannot protect our seas, we cannot be a competitor in this globe as Somalis, as society and a state, unless we defeat Al-Shabaab. It is the Achilles heels of our existence.
And of course, it's very important for those communities that you hold, because if you don't hold, there will be retribution for them. And I think that's a trust-building mechanism there, or process that becomes very crucial. One area that we've not engaged and that we need to discuss now is one of regional security. Somalia is a key part to the security puzzle of the Horn. And we've seen that recent developments are really shaking the place. One is the memorandum of understanding between Ethiopia and Somaliland, getting Ethiopia access to the sea. Two is the war in Sudan. Three is Somalia's membership in East Africa Community. Of course, we also have the defense and economic agreement between Turkey and Somalia. All these are drivers of something, whether it's going to be a full-blown conflict between the various countries, or it's going to transition to something. Can you address some of these issues, particularly the first one, right? The first ones, meaning the Memorandum of Understanding. We know there's been this issue about sovereignty of Somaliland and the position of Ethiopia. And now we have the Turkey-Somalia deal, which itself, though it's been said to help Somalia protect its seas, its shores against piracy, against so on, we know the potential there, the explosive potential.
Well, up until now we were discussing Somalia as if it's this little island in isolation from the rest of the world. But Somalia is indeed part and parcel of the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea area and the larger African continent. And what transpires in the region would have severe consequence to begin with, first of all, on the Somali people. Any negative development in the region, in the form of a new conflict, in the form of intrusion into our lands by some of our neighbors, has a serious consequence on the one and only priority we have as our number one priority, which is to fight off al-Shabab. So as we were successfully fighting off al-Shabab, finalizing our debt relief, arms embargo, thinking about our future development, aspirations, on the 1st of January this year, the Ethiopian government decided to get into an MOU with Somaliland, which is part and parcel of the Somali state, despite some grievances in Somaliland about the nature of the union in the past. There has been constant dialogue processes to accommodate the grievances of the people of Somaliland and ensure that their concerns are integrated into the constitutional review process, so that their political and other rights that they pursue are incorporated into Somalia's nation-building agenda. On the 1st of January, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, gets into an MOU with Somaliland, an MOU that clearly violates Somalia's sovereignty and integrity and unity. A very unexpected move and uncalled for in an already very volatile Horn of Africa. An MOU that we have not seen in its totality, but what we can extrapolate from a summary that has been given by the Ethiopian authorities and some public engagements done by the Somaliland leadership, is one that envisions the establishment of a naval base in the Somali seas and also ports. It's very ironic that Ethiopia would go to such a length. First of all, there is no shortage of accessibility to ports for Ethiopia. They use the port of Djibouti. They use the port of Berbera, which is part of Somalia, in Somaliland. They use the ports of Kenya, Eritrea. And we are more than willing to provide more ports in a legal and mutually beneficial arrangements. But this is akin to annexation in our reading of it. And the Somali government has clearly articulated that in various forums, from the African Union that was just concluded recently, to an IGAD forum, an extraordinary one that was called for during the non-alignment movement meeting in Kampala, Uganda, and in the UN and all the other forums. And most of the institutions have reaffirmed the need to respect Somalia's sovereignty. So I want to highlight one fact, that Al-Shabab, that is creating havoc for the Somali people, was not part of our history. The genesis and the foundations of Al-Shabab can be traced back to Ethiopia's earlier invasion of Somalia in 2006-07. That time under the claim that they were protecting the Somali government of the day. But the genesis of Al-Shabab can be traceable to that day. And, when the nation fails, people hold on to some radical ideas at times. So Al-Shabab was able to cash on that interference and the absence of a viable government to try to assert itself on the Somali people. And we think there is a huge risk there too. Finally, in Sudan, we are extremely saddened by the developments in Sudan as a nation that went through failure and struggles and fragility. We know how long it takes to come back from that path. We advise our Sudanese brothers. A lot of Somalis were educated in Sudan, were settled there when our nation failed. So we hope the best for them. On the issue of membership with the EEC, I think that is very expected, and Somalia, located strategically in the Red Sea, has a lot to offer to the rest of the East African community, and we will mutually benefit from both sides of the relationship. The Turkey agreement, we have partnerships, economic and security partnerships with various countries, and Turkey happens to be one of those. And in fact, the Turkish government has heavily invested in Somalia's health sector, security sector, and many other areas, infrastructure, in the past 10 years. And this agreement that we have now is one that ensures that the Somali state is able to develop in the long term a viable naval capabilities to protect its seas from the dumping of toxic materials, piracy, and uncertainties that comes in the seas, and also ensuring that our sovereignty is protected. I mean, Turkey is not the only partner we have. We have partnerships with the Americans. We have partnerships with many other Arab countries, and African Union has been a great partner for us. So it's one of those instruments at our disposal.
What you just said about Ethiopia's engagement in the region, I think without saying it, or maybe you meant to say it, that Ethiopia's action often has, the actions often have negative repercussions for the region, and the case of Al-Shabab being one of them. Do you see this latest action, the Memorandum of Understanding between Somaliland and Ethiopia, as such action with tremendous potential for trouble for both countries, Ethiopia and Somalia, but potentially more even for Somalia?
Well, of course, and I think the intelligence reports that we are getting indicate that Al-Shabab has already started to use this as a recruitment campaign in these developments. And as the Somali people were increasingly coming to reject Al-Shabab and its ways, this really risks our peace building and state building agenda in the immediate sense and also the long term. But this is not a threat to only Somalia. Ethiopia's ill-informed decision to infringe on the sovereignty and rights of the Somali state has the prospect of creating much bigger problem than just Somalia. Ethiopia itself is grappling with multiple domestic challenges. I mean, the Horn of Africa, when you look from faraway places, is known, sadly, for a history of conflicts. In the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you look back at history, it is a very dark history of war, intrastate, ethno-nationalism, communal, and this was the least expected move to create yet another wave of uncertainty and warfare. That is one industry that the Somalis wanted to shut down, the idea of engaging in warfare. It is not our calling. Till today, we are not propagating for a war with Ethiopia or any of our neighbors, but that does not mean we will not stand for protecting our sovereignty at whatever cost it may come.
Is the agreement between Turkey and Somalia a reaction to Ethiopia's action?
Well, the agreement between Turkey and Somalia is a continuity of a series of prior agreements and arrangements we have had. And it's a very timely one because Somalia intends to increase its economic growth capacity, and our future is tied to our seas, marine resources, fisheries, protecting them, preserving that, and also capitalizing on that in terms of trade, as well as utilization of our strategic location for our future economic growth model, and demands that we keep and protect our seas and shores. I mean, you recall we had a legal case with Kenya not that long ago that was amicably settled in the right institutions, in the International Court of Justice, and the ruling was in our favor. That was done in a very civilized way. But when it comes to the annexation of today, it can really be a source of concern. So maybe analysts would like to link the two developments. But Turkey for us has been a long-standing strategic partner.
Your Excellency, we'll take questions from the audience, the people who've been listening to us, who are interested in engaging with you directly. So the first question is, how is the government of Mogadishu approaching the recent port access deal made between Ethiopia and Somaliland? What does this mean for the future of Somalia and Ethiopia relations? That's our first question.
Well, I think I've just answered that. The Somali government has clearly and categorically rejected that deal and pronounced it as an illegal deal in the context of international law, in the context of customary law, in the context of normal trading and economic arrangements. Somaliland occupies a very strategic location in the Red Sea. And I'm from there, by the way. And the people of Somaliland have had a set of grievances in the past. And the various governments that existed in Somalia for the last many years have always tried to ensure that any development programs or investment that came in the way of Somaliland were not, restricted. For instance, there is this deal with the DP World, in which even Ethiopia was one of the investors in the modification and the enhancement of the Berbera port and the corridor that serves Ethiopia and other parts of Somaliland. So we are all up for legal and mutually beneficial arrangements that does not go against the sovereignty of Somalia. So the future of Ethiopia and Somalia, the question to answer it directly, depends on how we deal with this situation. We are yet and have not and do not intend to take any measures that would infringe on their sovereignty. And we ask them to retract from this rather unacceptable and illegal action. So the onus is on them in this case.
The next question is, does the government of Somalia have specific plans to take advantage of the ascension to the EAC, the East Africa Community?
Yes. It's still in the making, but as you would know, the Somali people are known, other than being very brave folks, they are known for their entrepreneurial and trading capabilities. Wherever you go to in Africa, you will find a Somali doing business, especially in the East Africa community. With our access to the Red Sea, the Arabian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and our trading capabilities, we hope to be able to capitalize on that in a very sectoral manner. So we are having a set of committees in agriculture, in fisheries, in transport, in investment and finance sectors of Somalia, and how they can benefit from this arrangement. We're also, part of COMESA. We are part of there's this much bigger initiative of Africa Free Trade Integration Agenda, World Trade Organization. So it will be one of those things we believe would be to the benefit of our business communities and the Somali state.
Speaking of the location, 'cause it's about location, location, location. As tension between the US and Yemen rise in the Red Sea, has Somalia been impacted? What is the Somali government view of these tensions in the Red Sea? How can they be resolved from your perspective?
Well, as one of the primary states in the Red Sea area, Somalia is of the view that the peace and the stability of the Red Sea is a prerequisite to the peace and the development of all of us in that region and other international actors who utilize the Red Sea route. So we call for a cessation of any hostilities in that arena. And for us as a community that for now imports about 70% of their food supply from outside, any disturbance in those global supply lines would have much more dire consequence on us than other communities. So we are all for restraint and peaceful and amicable solutions to any developments in the Red Sea area, and we call upon all our partners to pursue that objective.
Two more questions. Somaliland has struck a port deal with UAE, United Arab Emirates. Why the harsh reactions towards Ethiopia?
Well, for one, the UAE deal does not include the establishment of a naval base and security component in that past. It was a deal in which Somaliland and the UAE, the company, the DP World, and Ethiopia were looking at economic benefits of that arrangement. And the Somali government has been very cautious of taking measures that would be seen as an infringement on the development rights of Somaliland before the dialogue of unity is finalized. But these are not comparable arrangements. In fact, we just came from the African Union where we simply requested Ethiopia to pronounce that they respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Somalia, and they have not been able to do so in the public domain. So these are not two comparable scenarios. The Somali government that I am part of as someone from Somaliland is all up for any arrangements that are within the confines of rules of international law and customary law and best practice, business practices that would contribute to the well-being and the benefit of the people of Somaliland, the larger people of Somalia, and even to our neighbors. But it has to be done in an appropriate manner. It's akin to Somalia taking over, getting into an agreement with Amhara region and trying to take over the Tana River and all these things. It's just not prudent.
The last one, can you explain if the government is taking any steps to combat piracy off the coast, which can affect commerce?
Well, a lot of measures have been taken over the years, and piracy was becoming a thing of the past. I mean, 10 years ago, piracy was the lenses through which the world, or maybe 15 years ago, looked at Somalia, but it has been diminishing with time. There were few incidents here and there, one-off rare incidents, and one of the measures to cope with the long-term impact of piracy, piracy is a product of ungovernable spaces. It's a product of poverty. Pirates do not just appear out of nowhere. Pirates are a product of the prevailing circumstances in these conditions. So one of the measures is by getting into this agreement with Turkey, hopefully Somalia at large would develop the naval capabilities and the capacity to provide security to its coastal communities, to fend off illegal fishing, which is the the origins of the emergence of piracy in Somalia, and to create a conducive environment for trade and investment in the fisheries industry. So these are some of the measures we're taking.
Given all that you've said, Your Excellency, today, how should we think of the Horn today?
The Horn is a very interesting place that evokes very mixed feelings. It's a place that has great potential, hope, and offers a great deal of optimism. If the leadership of the Horn, in collaboration with their partners, would work on policies and economic programs that would integrate, enhance, and increase our trading capabilities, one. A set of policies that would address the root causes of the troubles of the Horn, which is lack of economic growth, and not arising from lack of resources in terms of human or other natural resources, but lack of investment of human capital. In my view, as an observer and one of the leaders of the Horn, I think I would be more optimistic, provided we don't take politically ill-informed and irrational decisions to create another set of conflicts. If you look at the reports produced by the UN, by international research institutions, the Horn of Africa has been identified as the most hard hit in terms of climate change. The Horn of Africa has been known and continues to be one of the most conflict-prone places in the world. The Horn of Africa has a lot of political issues to settle in terms of people's participation in politics and people's representation. The Horn of Africa is yearning for a better future, and much of it rests on the shoulders of its leaders. And it's moments like this when leaders should rise and work on sustainable agendas, not some unimaginable ideas that could create havoc once again in the Horn of Africa. When I was born, Somalia was at war with Ethiopia. When I left Somalia, Somalia was at war with itself. When I came back, the Somalis were at war with one another by trying to provide an alternative interpretation to Islam. I hope all those wars would be wars of the past, and the future would be one of mutual coexistence and the pursuit of better human conditions for our societies.
Your Excellency Salah Jama, Deputy Prime Minister of the Federal Government of Somalia, I would like to thank you for joining us today and offering your insight and perspective into development into your country, but into the Horn as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
This concludes our session for the day, and we thank you for joining us from whatever you did today. Thank you.